Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for signing on to this Gender and Urban Services webinar. It is right at 9:30. We're going to hold for another 2 minutes to allow our registrant list to sign on, and then we'll get started. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling from in the world. Thank you very much for joining this agent webinar hosted by IUCN and USAID. My name is Kate Oren, and I'm Senior Gender Program Manager with IUCN's Global Program on Governance and Rights. And it's my pleasure to introduce our session and our wonderful presenters. On behalf of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, allow me by beginning to thank each of you for your interest in this topic and for spending this time with us today. A very special thank you to USAID, as this webinar, as well as the joint work that we are presenting, has been made possible through their support, and specifically in partnership with the Office of Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. This webinar is also possible through a collaboration with the Land and Urban Office and Urban Links. Now, before I continue, a few brief virtual housekeeping matters. Participants will be kept in mute mode through the duration of this webinar. This is just to minimize disruptions, background noise, and connectivity issues. I will invite you to please notice the panel on the right-hand side of your screen, most likely on the right-hand side of your screen. Here you can find boxes for technical support and for sending questions to the panelists throughout this webinar. My colleague, Jamie Wen, will be supporting the technical aspects of this webinar, so please do feel free to reach out to her using the chat function if you have any technical difficulties. Now, we also use the chat function for your questions, and you're welcome to type them in at any time throughout the presentations. Please feel very welcome to send in questions throughout the webinar and specify the name of the panelist you're addressing, or of course, if the question is to everyone. Jamie and I will collect the questions and comments as we go, and indeed try to get to as many of them as possible after the series of presentations. Handouts are also available to accompany this webinar, again at the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel. And finally, I'd like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded, and both this video and the presentations will be made available online on our genderandenvironment.org resource hub and will be emailed to you in the following days. Advancing Gender in the Environment, AGENT, is a 10-year program launched by USAID in 2014 together with IUCN. The purpose of this partnership is twofold: to build the case for and increase the effectiveness of environmental programming through robust gender integration, and leveraging the opportunity that environmental work provides to improve gender equality and women's empowerment outcomes in a broad range of environmental sectors. AGENT's urban work supports the urban sector to be gender responsive by filling knowledge gaps, sharing best practices, and encouraging the documentation of experiences. Over 55% of the global population lives in urban areas, and rapid urbanization shifts social, economic, and political dynamics, with particular impacts on women's empowerment and gender equality. Despite the important roles and responsibilities of women as household and community decision makers, among others, women in cities, especially in slum areas, often face specific legal and societal restrictions that limit access to equal economic opportunities, property rights, healthcare, education, mobility, and decision-making, among others, which create significant barriers to accessing adequate urban services or benefiting from urban development interventions. Understanding these gender-related issues in urban service delivery supports successful interventions in urban planning and service delivery that can accelerate sustainable development outcomes and contribute to women's economic empowerment and gender equality across communities, decision-making levels, and sectors. This webinar will address major gender-related issues in equitable and sustainable delivery and use of urban services, including lack of access to resources, infrastructure, and decision-making spheres. It will also address considerations for integrating gender into urban service delivery and highlight successful urban waste management and recycling interventions that advance gender equality, increase women's economic empowerment, and contribute to sustainable urban development. Our agenda today includes 4 wonderful speakers. First, Emmett Boyer from IUCN will talk about the gaps, presenting one of AGENT's most recent knowledge products, a gender and urban services brief. Ruta Adis and Delilah Khaled, coming from Banyan Global, will discuss the opportunities, presenting findings from an assessment on USAID's women's economic empowerment and equality in waste management and recycling. And finally, Sylvia Petrova from USAID Land and Urban Office will talk about integrating gender in the sector, specifically sharing examples from USAID's municipal waste recycling program. Our objectives of this webinar today include introducing some of the main gender-related issues in urban service delivery and use, including lack of access to resources, infrastructure, and decision-making. We aim to understand how enhancing women's roles can promote effective and sustainable urban service delivery while supporting women's economic empowerment and gender equality. And we aim to explore how USAID is integrating gender into its urban programming through the Municipal Waste Recycling Program. With that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Emmett Boyer. Emmett is a program officer with IUCN's Global Program on Governance and Rights, where they've worked for the last 4 years. Emmett supports various IUCN projects on gender and environment issues and themes through capacity building, technical support, and knowledge development, including on food security, water management, climate resilience, and desertification. As part of our AGENT portfolio of work, Emmett led development of this urban brief and also supports other areas of work across the initiative, including a research report on the triple nexus of climate vulnerability, state fragility, and gender inequality, as well as a forthcoming expansive paper on gender-based violence and environment linkages. Emmett's background is in climate science and environmental policy with a focus on environmental justice. Emmett, I give you the floor.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're very happy to have you. So as Kate mentioned, their rapidly growing cities offer a range of urban development opportunities, and including for eradicating poverty and building inclusive, sustainable societies. However, high population densities, sprawling informal settlements, and rural to urban migration and displacement have presented pressing urban development and environmental challenges as cities struggle to keep up with the needs and demands of growing populations. And access to these basic services in urban areas is essential for the health and well-being and prosperity of people in urban areas. And, but the struggle to deliver these services in an efficient and safe manner due to unrelenting population growth and poor planning that does not integrate nature and is unreliable and unresponsive to user needs. These threats to urban services delivery exacerbate threats to the population, including displacement, violence, illness, malnutrition, and loss of livelihoods. This is especially evident for women and their families, as we found in our research and through the experiences that we've heard about. Women make up more than 40% of the poorest urban households, and they face specific legal and societal restrictions that limit access to equal economic opportunities, property rights, healthcare, education, mobility, and decision-making. However, women's roles are also responsibilities as household and community decision makers make them essential to formulating, leading, and participating in urban service delivery systems. And recognizing the ways in which gender shapes realities in cities and involving women in the design and implementation and management of urban development and planning projects has wide-reaching benefits for cities that make them more livable for women, men, and children. So it's under this kind of background that with USAID, IUCN developed this urban brief that is available in the handout section. It's called Advancing Gender in the Environment, or Gender in Urban Services. In this brief, we cover 4 different topics, 4 different basic urban services, including water and sanitation, energy, waste management, and transportation and mobility. This brief serves to build the knowledge base on the gender considerations in urban areas under these 4 basic services. And the opportunities are outlined across the sectors in the brief, reveal common threads of gender-related challenges and gender-responsive considerations in urban development. This is what I'm going to be going over in this presentation today, but I encourage you all to check out the full brief either on the handout section on the right-hand side of your screen or at urban-links.org, where you can see the full brief as well as the other materials that we'll be presenting on today. So the first challenge, or one of the challenges I'll be covering, is the lack of equitable access to livelihood and economics resources between women and men in urban areas, particularly those for living in slums and informal settlements where governments may have a hard time delivering basic services. Something that we found is that in urban areas where resources are not readily available to households, particularly where infrastructure has not been built up yet, women bear the brunt of the labor, time, and effort needed to secure access to these resources for the household. For instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, 50% of urban households have water available on the premises, but for those that do not, women hold the majority of the responsibility to collect water for the household. So as you can see in this graphic, of the 50% that do not have water on the premises, 33% in sub-Saharan Africa rely on women, 10% on men, and 7% on boys and girls. This limits everyone's time, but especially women's as the disproportionate responsibility holder to pursue educational, economic, and leisure activities, and leaves them more exposed to dangerous conditions that can increase their risk of GBV. Additionally, women in urban areas may lack access to economic opportunities, which impacts efforts to alleviate poverty and has resounding impacts on the entire household, as women tend to spend more money on education and health compared to their male counterparts. In waste management, for example, women and men that we found in the studies that we read for the brief, women and men both work in formal and informal waste management systems, but women tend to be paid less than their male counterparts and have less access to higher paying opportunities. One study of 6 urban areas found that in Cairo, women made up 26% of the workforce in the informal waste sector, but only 1% of the better paying and safer formal waste sector positions. This presents many issues for not only income generation, but also the ability for women to access structures and cooperatives that facilitate access to safe equipment and social protections in this often dangerous source of livelihood income. Another challenge that we found in the urban brief that we outline is the inadequate and unsafe urban infrastructure. And this is related to the lack of access and impacts, especially in densely populated informal settlements. Municipalities may struggle to provide needed infrastructure such as roads and public transportation options to all portions of the population. For example, in urban mobility is essential to connecting communities and facilitating opportunities across urban areas for income, civic, and social engagement, and for completing daily livelihood tasks. Women and men may have different mobility needs, and in many sprawling urban areas, unreliable or insufficient public transportation, sidewalks, and roads fail to meet those needs, especially for those living in informal settlements. One example that we found is that very often women rely on public transportation to get to work, take children to school, go to the market, access medical services, when their families are sick, etc. And these responsibilities usually require several trips a day and frequent stops on public transportation, which can become cost prohibitive depending on the number of transfers and the required and associated costs. Additionally, social stigma and safety impact how women use public transportation, sidewalks, and roads. Poor street lighting and crowded buses on trains are major concerns for the safety of women and girls in urban areas. One study, and this is pretty common in many major urban areas, but one study in Mexico City found that 64% of women in Mexico City have experienced some form of physical harassment on public transportation. That's a pretty startling statistic, and this is, again, something that is not uncommon in many major urbanized areas. This fear of harassment reduces women's mobility and access to resources and social structures, and it affects their willingness and ability to participate in school and work in public life. Infrastructure at the household level is also a major concern for the safety and well-being of urban populations, including women's and men's ability to access economic opportunities. For instance, while energy access is increasing in urban areas, the poorest portions of urban populations are still underserved by energy infrastructure. This creates many problems for energy companies to be able to access more informal or sprawling urban settlements and can result in illegal hookups to electricity lines that are both unsafe to the user and deliver substantial electricity that can damage property and appliances. And this leaves people vulnerable to price gouging and extortion from illegal service providers, especially women who may not have access to formal IDs to connect to legal hookups and are more vulnerable to the GBV. Additionally, in urban households without access to electricity or improved fuel resources still rely on inefficient, harmful energy resources such as kerosene for lighting and charcoal and firewood for cooking and heating. In Nigeria, for example, 40% of urban households rely on kerosene for cooking, causing household air pollution that negatively impacts the health of all members of the household, but especially women and children who are disproportionately responsible for cooking. While liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, is increasing in urban areas, the uptake is slow due to the inadequate infrastructure available to facilitate that use. All right, that was a lot. So those are just a couple of the challenges. More of these challenges are outlined again in the brief, going through each of those 4 sectors, and a lot more information on the different opportunities available, but I'm just going to run through real quick some of the elements that we found are fairly common across these 4 urban delivery systems to facilitate gender-responsive urban service interventions. And it is important to ensure that efforts to address challenges in urbanization consider the needs of entire communities, women, men, and children. And as I said, there are several programs and projects that are making active efforts to address these challenges in a gender-responsive manner, including in USAID, which I think we'll cover a couple of those examples today. One of the elements is to build capacity on gender-responsive urban development approaches, including through partnerships with municipal government agencies, women's organizations, and CSOs. This is so that when we are planning urban areas, we are taking into consideration the needs and the priorities, as well as the safety of all communities. Another is to identify and address gender-differentiated priorities, needs, responsibilities, and labor roles in urban service delivery, as well as the barriers to women's employment and urban development initiatives beyond the local level. A lot of the programs and projects that we reviewed looked into how they could build women's capacity to engage in different parts of the urban sector and increase their income in urban life, such as through, where appropriate, to drive trains, to drive buses, to direct traffic, to open food stalls along transportation routes. Those are a couple of the examples that we've seen to increase access to those livelihood opportunities in urban areas. And then, of course, promoting equitable leadership and economic opportunities for both women and men in the planning, design, construction, management, operation, and maintenance of urban service infrastructure, while sensitizing men to gender-related issues. This is especially an example in water and sanitation sector, in that helping to include women in the planning and the siting of different sanitation facilities and water facilities, and then allowing for opportunities for both women and men to both manage and upkeep those facilities, increase community engagement and ownership, and then sensitizing men to those gender-related issues helped to also make that more of a sustainable long-term impact. So these elements, as well as several other elements for each sector, are outlined in the brief, and I encourage you all to go check it out when you can. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand it back over to Kate to introduce our next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmett. And as we transition screens here, 2 quick reminders. I hope that participants will download the Gender and Urban Services brief, which includes hyperlinks to some of the range of examples that Emmett presented. And I also want to remind that you are most welcome to submit any questions and comments as they occur to you throughout these presentations, again, using the chat function in the control panel. Now, it is with great pleasure I turn to introduce 2 leaders in this field, Delilah Khaled and Ruta Adis. Delilah is an international development practitioner with 25 years of experience as a technical expert, program manager, business owner, and executive. She brings global expertise working in urban water, sanitation, and solid waste management with the public, private, and informal sectors across 20 countries. This expertise includes improving municipal service delivery and recycling systems, women's economic empowerment and gender integration, utility finance, and public-private partnerships. Ms. Khaled also specializes in inclusive governance and citizen engagement, entrepreneurship and inclusive financing, as well as post-emergency reconstruction. Delilah was a founding partner of the Development Innovations Group, where she served as executive vice president and was instrumental in building the firm's portfolio of these innovative programs funded by USAID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. These included pro-poor urban services delivery, commercial financing for water utilities, and plastics recycling to mitigate ocean pollution, namely USAID's Municipal Waste Recycling Program. Now, Dr. Ruta Adis is the founder and director of ACG Incorporated, research director at Gender Metrics, and senior fellow at George Mason University. She's a leading expert in women's economic empowerment, entrepreneurship and innovation, public policy, and economic development. She has over 25 years of experience and has authored over 50 publications that include gender mainstreaming strategies, evaluations, comparative metrics, and gender diagnostics, geared towards identifying best practices and action-oriented policy recommendations. I give you both the floor, and Delilah, I believe you're starting.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. This is Delilah Khaled, and together with my colleague, Dr. Ruta Adis, we will be presenting to you the results of our work for Banyan Global. USAID requested that Banyan Global, through its Advantage Women's Economic Empowerment and Equality Technical Assistance Project, conduct a global We3 gender analysis of the waste and recycling sector, with a particular focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. Our analysis consisted of a review of close to 300 documents and almost 40 key informant interviews. The primary constraint that we faced in our work was that of access to data. This was a chronic problem cited by experts worldwide facing the sector, and it was especially pronounced when it came to women. We found practically no sex disaggregated data, which really inhibited our ability to quantify women's contributions in the sector, though anecdotal evidence made it very clear that women are present in greatest numbers at the base of the value chain and play a significant role therein, as Emmett mentioned. In terms of our findings, you'll note that there are lots of similarities between the urban waste management and recycling sector and other areas of basic service delivery, except for, I would say, recycling and waste tend to be far more incipient. The informal sector play a key role in filling the municipal service delivery gap, as with other sectors. And I would also say that at all levels of the value chain, we found that women experience a very limited voice in terms of decision making, and that gender division of labor was also prevalent throughout the value chain. Worldwide, from Asia to Latin America, we found that women have less access to higher value plastics recyclables, to equipment, to market information, and to capital. This really inhibited their ability to earn higher income, to engage in trade, which was very male dominated, and to grow and protect their businesses from market shocks. Women, especially those that work in the informal sector, tended to be the most marginalized members of society, facing the dual stigma of both poverty and profession. They worked in the most hazardous work conditions and were subject to sexual exploitation and harassment, and often had no legal protections. One of our main findings in this area of note was that those women who do work in the informal sector, when given the choice, did not prefer to formalize for a number of reasons, including the fact that it robbed them of the flexibility in terms of time use and being able to serve as caregivers and take care of other income generating activities. With regard to the legal framework for waste management and for gender, we found that this really varied from one country to the next, but what was common worldwide was that enforcement was weak, and this was especially true at the municipal level. Now, moving on to our recommendations at the global level, women need to be substantively involved at all levels of planning and planning and implementation. And we're talking about from making decisions about collection routes along roads and timing for accessing landfills to ensure their security and convenience, to having women play a more active role in executive level, private sector, in NGOs and cooperatives. We need to also work on demystifying waste and recycling as masculine work. We need to start early, working at educational and vocational level institutions, but we also need to work with ministries of public works and within other public sector entities to ensure that both men and women are experiencing this reframed messaging. We need to also work to strengthen women's leadership and organization within the sector. We found that women were very active and very vocal at the grassroots level. However, they were pretty much blocked out of all leadership positions that we found. I would say all, but by and large, most leadership positions at the grassroots level and within the cooperators and recycler movements. The other recommendation that we have was to improve gender equity in terms of access to recyclables for waste pickers and collectors. A great example of this that I've come across in our work was in the Philippines, in Quezon City. Many of you may be familiar with the famous Payatas landfill, where there was a landslide in, I believe it was 2000, and some 1,000 people died. They've since converted that to a great success model where they have basically divided the landfill up into grids, allowing separate groups of men and women to have access to different parts of the landfill at different times of the day to ensure equal access to the different values of recyclable materials present. Our next recommendation was to strengthen gender-based violence awareness, prevention, and reporting at all levels of the value chain and within the public and private sectors. Also, to increase women's access to understanding and application of market information. This was an area where men dominated the sector entirely, and women need appropriate access to technology and information that they can use to develop businesses and to trade. And finally, dovetailing on that point, increasing access to credit and professional training for female recyclers so that they can grow and start businesses. And I believe there are lots of lessons learned for that from other sectors. With that, I will pass the mic on to Dr. Adis to pick up on our Latin America recommendations.
Thank you so much, Delilah, for the global overview. I'm going to speak specifically on our findings for the LAC region, but I want to stress that many of the recommendations and findings that Delilah presented also are applicable in the LAC countries as well. So if you look at we're highlighting 5 recommendations for you this morning for the LAC region. The first is that context and country, specificities matter, and so it's very important to design interventions to take that into account. The LAC region is not homogeneous, and one size does not fit, all the different varieties of situations that you find within these countries. The second is that there is a real opportunity in LAC to leverage national gender laws to evolving waste management, recycling, and solid waste management legislation. And what that means is that in many LAC countries, they're still in the early stages of formulating waste management and recycling legislation, and it's a prime opportunity to integrate gender now before that legislation is adopted, to ensure that that's going to be taken into account in the years to come in this sector. Our third recommendation is to encourage engendering of human resources practices in the very male-dominated waste management and recycling sector in LAC. And you don't have to start from square one with this endeavor, because USAID, for example, has been doing a lot of work in the utilities sector, which is also very male-dominated, and identifying some very useful best practices for human resources in order to attract and retain women in not only as employees, but in decision-making positions. Our fourth recommendation is to improve the livelihoods and working conditions of female waste pickers. And though we don't have exact numbers, it's estimated that 4 million waste pickers are active in the LAC region, and a significant amount of those are women. And these individuals play a very important role in LAC in the waste management and recycling value chain. And our final recommendation is to promote the adoption of existing social responsibility certification programs that promote gender equality and safe, women-friendly workplaces. Luckily, and what's pretty incredible in the LAC region is there are already a number of voluntary programs that exist, such as the logo shown on this slide for Peru's Empresa Segura program. And now I wanted to move into some of the lessons that we learned in LAC that we wanted to highlight, something that sort of we didn't expect, but we found to be present in many of the countries there. The first is, in our report, you'll see that we talk a lot about the traditional attitudes and expectations towards gender roles and power dynamics in LAC that are based on the machismo sort of attitudes and sort of social norms. But we wanted to also stress that we saw that there's these gender dynamics are also evolving, albeit maybe in a slow pace, but it's important to look for some of the opportunities that may exist for the waste and management and recycling sectors, such as there are a number of young women who are now interested in recycling and don't understand how maybe they could become involved in waste and management and recycling, or use those skills in a job and to advance within the sector. The second is that we found that there's really a legislative precedence for including gender in waste management and recycling, that the building blocks are already there. Gender equality or equity considerations in national strategy plans show that the need for gender integration is understood at the national level in many LAC countries, but budgetary allocations are low and implementation and enforcement is often lacking. And then our third lesson is related to what Delilah already mentioned in terms of the chronic data limitations when it comes to the sector and getting an overview of women's participation. And we really encountered that in doing our research in the LAC region. Since no data was available, we had to depend on stakeholder and key informants to provide us information, and sometimes that information was contradictory, and we had no way to validate or substantiate to what degree what is women's exact participation. And this is really important when you think about developing projects in the region. And our fourth lesson is related to really the need to ensure project sustainability. In our work in the LAC region, we noticed that there were a number of promising projects that had been started, but were often abruptly ended due to the lack of funding. And that highlights the importance of engaging the government and private sector to assist in sustainability. So actually, the project reaches success. And the final one is related to the notion trash is cash. And what this refers to is the important role incentives play in recycling efforts. So for example, we noticed that there's increasing interest in recycling among municipalities in Peru because the municipality leaders realize that recycling can generate significant revenue. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to your questions that we'll answer at the end.
Thank you so much, Delilah and Ruta. That was a wonderful presentation where you touched on a wide range of findings, recommendations, and really interesting lessons learned. Thank you very much. And I have a feeling questions are going to start rolling in for you. In meantime, I will invite the three speakers so far to keep in mind a question that has already come in. Somebody looking for more specific examples of good practices and success stories on developing gender responsive and inclusive waste management systems, both formal and informal, that are helping to reduce plastic waste to support a global project designed to reduce ocean plastic waste. So keep that in mind as we transition here. And now I'm delighted to introduce Sylvia Petrova, who serves as an urban geospatial technology specialist and gender advisor at USAID's Office of Land and Urban. Sylvia provides targeted technology assistance to missions to support sustainable urban and cross-sectoral programming. As urban gender advisor, she leads the gender integration work specific to the waste management and recycling sector through the Municipal Waste Recycling Program. Ms. Petrova brings also an environmental perspective to the urban portfolio of the office based on her experience in natural resource management sectors. Prior to joining USAID, she worked as a geospatial and climate specialist at Winrock International, where she developed and applied geospatial approaches for climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions in agriculture and forestry sectors. Ms. Petrova holds a master's degree in geospatial information science for development and environment from Clark University in Massachusetts, as well as both master's and bachelor's degrees in computer science from Technical University in Sofia, Bulgaria. Sylvia, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katie, for the introduction, and good morning to everyone joining us today. It's my pleasure to be part of this webinar and to share the experience of their municipal waste recycling program, one of the USAID flagship programs, and their integration of the gender issues in this sector. As we know, women account for half of their potential human capital in any economy, and yet they face numerous barriers that disadvantage them as they pursue employment, business, and investment opportunities. At USAID, we know that women and girls are a powerful force for change, and then the gender equality leads to better societies. We have a long history of addressing gender issues in development. And with the release of the Gender Equality and Women Empowerment Policy in 2012, we cemented our commitment on these issues. Our development programming is guided by the policy and their directives. And the policy help partner countries to their pursuit of journey for self-reliance. With this in mind, I want to introduce another topic, and that is related to the program that I will share lesson from. Ocean plastic. Ocean plastic is not a new issue, but recently has received international and national attention. And it has become the conversation of the environmental crisis of our time. How ocean plastic has related to urban services. In 2015, the research led by Jenna Jembeck made a breakthrough in quantifying the plastic floating in our ocean and its source. She and her research team estimated that 80% of the plastic in the ocean comes from our land, it has land-based sources, and mostly as mismanaged plastic waste. Excuse me. Which defines that the mismanaged plastic waste is defined as waste that is not captured in a sustainable way in the solid waste management services, and it's littering on the street and transported either via waterways or wind to the ocean. The research also ranked the countries that are the top polluters of the waste in the ocean. The top 5 countries are in Asia and were estimated to be responsible for 50% of the plastic in the ocean. In 2015, the US Congress directed USAID to use small grants to support efforts to recycle waste that threatens human health and the environment. And in 2016, USAID launched its municipal waste recycling program with the goal to reduce land-based sources of marine plastic pollution by supporting local intervention to improve solid waste management in recycling, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas in Indonesia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam, 4 of their 5 top countries. The approach of the program includes grant mechanism. 5.5 million are reserved for small grants that are given to local organizations in this country to implement innovative and locally based solutions to improve their solid waste management practices. The project also evaluates the grant results and generate lessons learned, which helps USAID to provide policy recommendation and to interact in the international cooperation. Very recently, in April 2019, USAID signed an agreement with Circular Capital, leveraging over 100 million in private sector capital, which will be used to incentivize investment in businesses and infrastructure projects in the recycling value chain in South and Southeast Asia. With that, sorry, I'm having a difficulty. I figured it out. So in almost 3 years of implementation of the program has awarded 30 locally led projects, and I will be sharing some of the lessons learned through the grantees. First, we discovered that women are a reliable workforce to carry innovative solid waste management solutions. Women are very active in their participation and beach and community cleanup. Almost all of the grantees that are implementing such kind of activity, women are very easy to mobilize, and they're very receptive to these activities. Also, they are operating and participating in waste banks and new activities that increase their income generation. For example, in Indonesia, we have a project in Sorong city that supports decentralized waste recycling cooperation at the neighborhood level through education, technical assistance, and transportation. Most of these mini banks are actually operated through women entrepreneurs, and women account to 70% of the participating members selling waste materials and in this small waste bank. Women are also a powerful asset when included in partnership, and they bring strength and different perspective and different understanding to the partnership. For example, in Sri Lanka, one of our grantee collaborates with the Negrus Women for Tomorrow's Foundation to obtain obtain support for the zero waste sari store initiative. Sari stores are like a bulk stores where you can go and buy things in bulk, and they're not packaged. You can bring your own packaging or your own bags. The foundation provides small-scale microfinance loans to our predominantly women-owned stores. Also in Vietnam, one of our grantees is working closely with their local women unions in Cat Hai district and reaching agreement with the local government to train women union members as a trainee and communicators that disseminate information to community residents on environmental protection and how to reduce plastic waste at the household level. When awareness and education is provided to women and they're empowered, their participation is increased in solid waste management initiatives. For example, in Sri Lanka, the local grantee supported women to launch plastic collection micro enterprises in communities located to beaches and canals where plastic waste disposal is prevalent. Women decide when and how much plastic they will collect. They have the freedom to decide at what time of the day and be able also to conduct their household chores. So that provides them with flexibility. Also, they separate the different recyclable that collect from the beach and provide it to their community-based collection point and earned additional income. Again, in Sri Lanka, another grantee is working with women leaders in 22 villages to provide training on community-based awareness around recycling. And there's this women-owned and community-based organizations are taught how to separate waste and then are transported to the collection point. Actually, collection person from the village comes and collects their different recyclables. Also, since the villages are determined to decrease the use of plastic bags, women organized in enterprises to sew bags of their old saris. And finally, when it comes to independent waste collector or waste picker, training and technical support is very important to empower them. In Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City, one of our grantees is working diligently to increase the participation of women in its project activities, and has succeeded in expanding leadership role for women in the key position within the independent waste collectors organizations. A woman has recently selected to lead one of their independent waste collectors cooperatives. Also, grantee is training more than 4,000 independent waste collectors, of which 40% are women, on plastic recycling, advocacy, access to health protection services, income generation, and business development. These efforts have been influenced the positive changes in Ho Chi Minh City solid waste management fee-for-service regulations that directly impact the income of the independent waste collection. Those are just some of the examples and lessons learned from the municipal waste recycling program. But I also invite you to learn more about the program and the grantees on our website, urban-links.com/ocean-plastics. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was a really interesting presentation. We have just under 10 minutes left, and we have a number of questions that we're going to try to get through quite rapidly. So again, highlighting any existing additional success stories. I'm going to toss that to you, Emmett, in just a moment, to inform a global program to reduce marine plastic. Delilah and Ruta, a couple of questions for you. Ruta, you spoke specifically to the LAC-specific context, but a very interesting question. Do you have a sense of what is the legislative precedence for gender and waste management recycling in Asia? Take a minute to think about that. And then another question, you mentioned USAID's work on gender in HR policies and systems in the utilities sector. Can you speak to that a bit further and share some examples? And then Sylvia, a question for you. You talked about a lot of different kinds of strategies, including community-based awareness campaigns to promote recycling, for example. Are there other strategies for working cross-sectorally on waste management recycling, for example, with fisheries or with other non-environmentally focused sectors? So speakers, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourselves and throw out some answers to these very diverse questions. Emmett, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I think, Sylvia gave a really, the example from USAID, the different grantees have really interesting and innovative strategies to reduce ocean plastics and increase recycling. In the brief that we wrote, which is available again in the handouts and on urban-links.org, we outlined some different examples that talk both for informal waste and formal waste management sectors. One is about a recycling program in Brazil, which reduces the labor burden on men and waste collectors by exploring the use of separated curbside waste collection, door-to-door pickup, drop-off points for channeling municipal waste streams, and ensuring that both women and men's priorities are considered for the location and modality of those waste collection. So go ahead and you can go onto the brief and there's a link to that case example. There's another one that we saw I think it's this organization, sorry, it's slipping my mind right now. But anyway, basically trying to increase worker cooperatives and unions and associations among informal waste sector to make sure that they have the training opportunities, employment, and protections that often are not afforded to them. So again, go ahead and go to that brief, and there's a bunch of different links that are available to check those out in more detail.
Thanks, Emmett. Delilah and Ruta.
This is Ruta. I'd like to respond to sort of the second half of the question, sort of flip it around first.
Sure.
The question regarding the utility sector and the resources available through USAID for that. I can't plug this work more than if possible. It's amazing. They have recently written a report called Engendering Utilities, Increasing Women's Participation in the Power Sector Through Human Resources Interventions, a Best Practices Framework. And this document's available online through USAID. We could even post it on our webinar. But what makes this document so wonderful for practitioners is it really focuses on the practical aspects. It actually has tables breaking down, for example, the different important parts of human resources, from recruiting to retaining to promoting staff to training staff, and identifying what are the obstacles for gender that have been found, and then what are opportunities and strategies to address those obstacles for women's full and equal participation in the male-dominated sectors of utilities. But a lot of this can easily be adopted or transferred to sectors like waste management and recycling. And the report even has like hyperlinks directly to different practical resources. So I think these are really exciting new developments within the field, where we get these really practically oriented documents for how to move forward in engendering environments that have been very male dominated. I also wanted to just add, this issue is not just for developing countries, it's a big problem in developed countries. We don't even know how many women are working in waste management recycling in the United States. But there's a wonderful new organization called Women of Waste, started 2 years ago from the International Solid Waste Association, ISHWA, and you can also Google them online. And they are a growing group of women working in this sector who want to increase visibility of women in different roles. They conducted an online survey of women to voluntarily provide information about their experiences and their roles, and their creating, so they're
Uh-oh, I think we have a little bit of a connectivity issue.
Yeah, Ruta.
I think we've lost Ruta's sound, so perhaps I can ask Delilah or other speakers to chime in.
This body of. Oh, okay. Delilah, maybe I don't know if you have some ideas about gender precedence in Asia, legislation in Asia. We did a deeper dive into Latin America. We didn't really get the opportunity to look that closely at Asia. I don't know if Delilah has any comments on that.
Sure. I mean, honestly, based on some previous experience, what I can say about Asia is that there's actually a pretty robust framework for both the solid waste management and for gender. If you look at the Philippines, for example, they actually, I think, were one of the first countries to sign on to CEDAW and have a pretty robust framework, as well as their environment. I can't remember the exact term, but their environmental legislation, which is pretty robust, even compared to Latin America, for example. But what you do not see is an intersection of this legislation, so that there are protections for gender and for the informal sector within the solid waste management framework. And when there is, you still do not see the translation of that into enforcement really on the ground. So I would say that is, without going into so much detail, I would say that it's pretty safe to say that would be commonplace throughout the region. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Sylvia, would you like to respond to the question? Then another interesting one, a couple have come in that we won't have time for, but just one more to sneak into the discussion. Most of this discussion has been on recycling, but what about the other two R's, meaning reduce and reuse? Sylvia.
Yes, Thank you for the questions. So I'll start first with the recycling and the community other sectors, for example, the fishery. The municipal waste recycling program also have grantees that are working with fisheries, local fishermen, to be able to reduce the plastic bottles that they're using while they're out in the sea. Most of the fisheries, they're using plastic bottles, and later on they're throwing it as well in the sea. So what the grantees are working either with the fishermen community or organizations or with the different dogs to be able to for fishermen to understand that they have to bring their bottles back for recycling. Since the municipal waste recycling program is working with the land-based sources of plastic pollution, none of the grantees is working with their fishing nets, which they're also a big part of the marine debris in the ocean. On their other R's, I would add that reducing, yes, most of the examples presented here as on the recycling, but also in terms of reducing the plastic bags, many of the grantees are conducting campaigns to use cloth bags or additional alternatives of plastic bags. The example that I shared about the sari sari or the bulk store in Sri Lanka it's just one of these approaches. Also, many of the grantees are supporting women who are producing alternative bags to the plastic bags, or grantees are working with our stores and large corporation to be able, either with local stores or large corporation, to be able to reduce the use of plastic bag and increase the awareness of using alternatives to plastic bags. I hope that answered the questions.
Thank you so much. I think so. We're a couple of minutes over time, so we're going to conclude, as we do have respect for your time. You have contact information on your screen, and if you have further questions or comments for any of the speakers, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will be very happy to try to field your questions directly or indeed connect you with our wonderful speakers today. I want to thank each of you panelists, our partners, including USAID, for spending this time with us this morning and for making this webinar possible. After a brief summer break, this agent webinar series will continue in autumn, including on the topic of gender-based violence and environment links, presenting new research that will publish later this year. And finally, a reminder that this webinar and all of the presentations are recorded and available online and will be sent to participants following this webinar. Thank you all so much, and here's wishing you a fabulous day.